Hello students, welcome to our continued discussion of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. This discussion will cover section 9 of the essay. Now, if you're wondering and looking for probably the clearest presentation of Coates' own case for reparations, the point that he's probably trying to make to you in the clearest way possible as why reparations would be a good thing, his opinion is probably most strongly articulated in section 9 here. In many ways, section 9 is the conclusion of a lot of the ideas of the essay. And is the clearest, as we said, the clearest articulation of those ideas. And an explanation as to why reparations would not just be maybe a just thing to do, but would be good for the entire social fabric of the United States. So if you're kind of wondering what the point is of his essay, reread section 9 very closely and you will be able to understand it. So section 9 begins, and Coates describes to us a symbol that he feels should be used for white supremacy. Coates argues that the idea of white supremacy in the United States brings up ideas of colored-only signs. You know, these signs that would say that restaurants were for white people only, or drinking fountains, or swimming pools, or schools, or buses. He says that's what many people have in their head when we think of the dangerous ideology of white supremacy. But Coates says we should instead have in our head the idea of a pirate flag. This pirate flag goes back to the ideas expressed throughout the essay that one of the key tenets of white supremacy was the plunder of African American labor and bodies in terms of slavery. Was a loud plunder. You know, their labor was done for free because they were a piece of property. After the Civil War and the transmission of Jim Crow laws to segregationist housing policies to the various legal and extra-legal ways that African Americans were on the receiving end of racial exploitation became the quiet plunder. So the key defining element of white supremacy is the desire to steal the labor and goods from African Americans. If you remember in section 8, we ended with a quote by Billy Brooks talking about how, as an African American man, he got the message from society that anything he had could just be taken from him. This is the idea of a pirate flag. So Coates is underscoring that white supremacy is at its core a supremacy that relies on theft and stealing from others that are unlike you. So when he talks about the inherent roots of white supremacy and the way that is built into concepts of U.S. national identity, he wants to stress that the deep, corrosive and obstinate differences between African American communities and the African American experience and the white experience radiate painful roots into the family and the nature of the individual. These differences are not racial differences. They are solely and simply the consequence of ancient brutality, past injustice, and present prejudice. So this notion of a pirate flag as a symbol for white supremacy values is something that references the ancient brutality of slavery and segregation, but also represents the present prejudice that can guide and control many actions that we see today. The present prejudice would be something that many of the Black Lives Matter protests you may be hearing about on the news are trying to speak towards and bring to the forefront of the American conversation. And so all of this ties back together to the idea that there has been a quiet, in quotes, plunder of African Americans, and this has been found at a deep and systematic level throughout American history. And Coates' entire essay, if you look at it top to bottom, start to finish, he provides you many examples of this quiet plunder and how this quiet plunder affected actual living people with interviews of Clyde Ross and the many people discussed in the essay. So, continuing on from section 8's notion of the wealth gap. right? And why we can't just look at money, the gap between money of different groups, and understand the full grasp of the issues of racial exploitation. The wealth gap is a term that measures the differences in wealth between various classes. Elite rich, upper class, middle class, working poor, and so forth. But you can also use the wealth gap to see the massive amount of differences the average African American earns versus the average white person earns. You see a significant gap there. And for Coates, the wealth gap is sort of the numerical proof that highlights the racial disparity in the United States. He looks at statistics in the differences between the money made by the average African American family and the average white family, and he points to that and says this merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. So he's basically saying that if we approach the notion of the wealth gap, what we see is the evidence of this quiet plunder, all right, of the stealing of African American labor from slavery through Jim Crow to the selective distribution of services that excluded African Americans in the post-World War II part of American history. So the wealth gap is something he can point to and says should be representative of the quiet plunder. As he states earlier in the essay, you can look through and find our discussion of this, that if the nation was truly equal, if the nation was truly colorblind, the wealth gap would be correlated on a bunch of different factors, and we couldn't point to a wealth gap that solely existed on racial factors. So if the nation was truly a nation where everyone had an equal opportunity for success, we would see the differences in wealth align across the board as opposed to having these concrete creations of wealth gaps that exist solely in terms of race. Finally, how does Coates frame reparations in this system? Does he view it simply as a financial idea? So, at its core, and this is probably the clearest and most distilled point that Coates is trying to make with the entire article. Coates' idea of reparations would not be, for him, just a financial remuneration for past damages. It would be the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. For Coates, reparation is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. So if you remember the quote from the former president of Yale, who said that Americans must reckon with the great gifts the founding fathers and people who formed the country gave us in terms of freedom and economy and constitution and a set of laws. If we're going to accept all of those benefits, we must accept the debts. We must reckon with the damages those same people caused in the creation of the country, things like slavery, so forth. For Coates, reparations would finally allow us to do that. It would recognize that this country has a part of it that is unjust and would allow us to move past that. It would allow us to finally recognize that history, legitimize that history, and begin to move past it. In many ways, for Coates, reparations would provide a sense of closure, some emotional closure that would allow the U.S. to finally start accurately living up to the promises of a place where everyone is free under an impartial, non-bigoted set of laws. So reparations would be a way for America to see its history clearly and account for the damages done throughout that history. It is an acceptance of the debts and privileges accorded to everyone living as contemporary Americans. It would be for Coates a national reckoning that could lead to a spiritual renewal. So that's something that is very important, in that for Coates, the benefits of reparations would not just be for African Americans. It would be to finally have an acknowledgement of the country that would allow this country to move past this idea, would allow this country to start addressing the racial inequalities built into it. It would allow Americans to view themselves with an unflinching eye. In many ways, Coates' idea of reparations is based on the system of apology and forgiveness, where there is a set of theory that in order to have a true apology, it must be separate from any notion of forgiveness. So reparations would not represent a moment where maybe African Americans would forgive this long history. But that's not the point. Reparations would be a presentation of an apology without the expectation of forgiveness. And for Coates, that would begin a process of a spiritual renewal where America could finally address its problems and begin to fix them. But without first recognizing that there is a problem, without the recognition that you must apologize without any expectation of forgiveness, to make amends, to make reparations, without this step for Coates, no spiritual renewal will happen. The quiet plunder will continue, and the tension found at the heart of quote-unquote American values would continue to be one filled with racial exploitation. In many ways, Coates is saying that in order to fix a problem, first we must address the problem. We will finish our discussion of Coates' essay when we discuss the end, section 10.